Hey there, I am Carl T. Rogers, a writer, director, and film professor. And today we're going to break down how the new Netflix film, A House of Dynamite, despite its technical brilliance from director Catherine Bigelow, fails in its final moments because it violates a fundamental principle of storytelling and human psychology, the open loop. Now, if you've not seen the movie yet, that's okay. I will kind of summarize what's happening here. But yes, spoilers ahead. The basic situation is that a missile has been launched at the US. It's probably a nuclear missile. And you get to see a lot of different government officials and military personnel reacting to this and trying to prevent this disaster from happening at multiple different perspectives. And you get to see it happen over three different scenarios or kind of timelines. And so you get to see like characters at the missile defense base in Alaska. You get to see Stratcom in DC, which is where Rebecca Ferguson's character is. You get to see the deputy national security advisor as he's running from his car towards the official building that he's supposed to go to, and he's calling into this important meeting on his phone. You get to see the somebody who works for FEMA, who is a designated evacuee. You get to see her experiences. You get to see a North Korean expert being called on her day off. She's taking her son to a battlefield reenactment at Gettysburg. You get to see the Secretary of Defense right here. You get to see the president, played by Idris Elba. And so you get to see all of these really high tension moments with high stakes played out several times from a lot of different perspectives. However, there was no ending. And I don't just mean that the ending was ambiguous, like some kind of art house film, or that it didn't end the way I wanted it to. Like, oh, I wish she'd married him instead of him. I just mean it didn't have an actual resolution. It didn't have a, as the film theorists would say, it did not have a denouement or whatever, right? And so if you want to know why Catherine Bigelow actually wanted it that way, then stick around to the end because we're going to explain why and how that actually backfired, in my opinion. So the ending, or the lack thereof, of the film actually undercuts everything that came before when it comes to A House of Dynamite. And if you disagree with me, that's fine. But as a writer and director, I think that there is a fundamental flaw in this approach that the filmmakers took with how they, basically gutted the ending from this story. And it has to do with a concept I learned in my day job as a user experience or UX strategist called open loops. So, an open loop is a term from behavioral psychology that describes any kind of unsolved mental task or an open question that stays active in someone's mind, creating this cognitive tension or an increased cognitive load that burdens someone's memory until the task is resolved or the question is answered. And this is based on something called the Zeigarnik effect, which was discovered by a psychologist named Bluma Zeigarnik. And this is the psychological tendency of our brains to remember more about an unfinished task than a finished one. You could almost think of it like, here with this puzzle. You're going to think more about the puzzle that has the pieces missing that you haven't finished yet than you are about the puzzle that you completed because that's kind of been resolved, right? And so you can actually apply this to screenwriting in two different levels. The first is kind of the main narrative question that your audience is wondering based on your first act and everything that you have set up with your characters and their goals and their needs. And I could call these macro loops. And I'll show you what I mean with a film like Pirates of the Caribbean. You could do this for almost any film, but basically the central narrative questions surrounding the film have to do with our protagonists and their goals, right? Will rescue Elizabeth and will Jack beat Barbarossa and get his ship back? He's Captain Jack Sparrow. Well, I don't see your ship. So he needs to get his ship back, right? He needs to get revenge for being marooned and all that stuff. Will that happen? Those are the main macro loops, kind of narrative questions that the audience is asking. They found out at the beginning what it is, and they say, what will happen at the end with this? But then you can also pose these smaller, more focused narrative questions throughout your script to keep the audience engaged because they want to find out the answer to these questions. And these are your micro loops. For example, to continue with Parts of the Caribbean, you could say, well, why does Jack have a compass that doesn't point north? Um, will Will actually become a pirate? Will he not? Is Elizabeth going to marry Norrington like her father wanted? If he does become a pirate, will Elizabeth still want him? Will the undead pirates ever be made mortal? How did Jack escape being marooned? All of these different kind of micro questions that essentially keep the audience asking what will happen next. So that's kind of the difference between the micro and the macro loops, right? The macro loop says what will happen at the end, and the micro loop says what will happen next. These open micro loops then drive curiosity and build suspense because they all tie back to the larger macro loops or narrative arcs. So at the heart of it, this whole micro and macro loop technique is all about setup and payoff, right? It's just a different way to build in setup and payoff, which is fundamental to great storytelling. And so when you come to something like The House of Dynamite, it does have a compelling concept and perspective, right? It's asking us to experience how our nation's top leaders make incredibly difficult decisions under impossible circumstances with unimaginable stakes, right? Nuclear war, global nuclear war. And so I will be the first to say that, House of Dynamite was well executed as a film in the technical sense. So it's, of course, well researched. It's excellently directed by Catherine Bigelow. It's got these solid performances from all these actors and actresses. And the whole experience up until the ending was a well orchestrated ticking clock kind of thriller. And I also want to point out that because of its complexity, well, the different perspectives, it also had great editing because they were able to piece together all of these different versions of the same scenario, which all touch each other. So the kind of you see someone on the TV in the background, and they're seeming to interact with the actors that are on set, and then in the next scenario, you actually see that person's perspective, and it all kind of works, and it's incredibly complex, but this complexity, coupled with the many narrative threads, end up creating a ton of open loops that the film actually refuses to tie up. So here are some of the film's micro loops, right? We've got the commanding officer at the Alaskan base, and he's having some kind of problems with his girlfriend or wife or something. Ferguson's characters, her husband is taking care of their sick son. So we see him sick in bed at home, and then we see him at the doctor's office. There's another man who's working with Rebecca Ferguson. I forget his character's name. And he is about to propose to his girlfriend. And so we see him looking at his phone, thinking about his girlfriend, trying to get his phone, wanting to contact her, knowing he's not supposed to, thinking about getting his ring. We see the deputy national security advisor's wife is pregnant. We've been seeing the bomber pilots, and they talk about buying presents for kids, and then later we see them get in the bomber, the B-2 bomber, and actually flying towards some kind of target. We don't know where. And then the micro loop that is the most offensive of all, the IT guy. So early on in the film, there is this IT guy in Stratcom who was actually fixing the TV when the missile launch alert came in. He was one of these guys over here in this scene, like trying to fix one of the TVs. And he looked super freaked out, almost like he kind of shouldn't have been in there when it happened, but he was supposed to be there to just fix the TV, and it all happened so fast, and he kind of saw more than he should have. Totally understandable for that kind of high stress circumstance. But it's not just that they showed him and that he's a throwaway character. It's actually they made a point to show him sneaking out of Stratcom and heading towards an exit, looking around like he's about to do something. They almost made it seem like he was going to head towards the press room, which was next door. There was a press conference. Maybe he was going to leak this to the press because he was so freaked out. We even see another employee kind of watch him leave. And so it's not just that he runs out of the room scared. We actually spend time building him up to say, this character is important. He's going to do something important, and his actions will be meaningful, but then nothing ever comes of it. It's kind of like a nothing burger at the end of the day. And so that's what I mean when I say that in A House of Dynamite, there's a lot of things that have been set up, but not a lot of them actually paid off. And it feels the same way for the rest of these characters and all of their personal stakes that I talked about. This person and their loved one and their spouse and their children and all of these things. almost like those moments were just there to humanize the characters, to give them a little bit of depth outside of their job so that we would care about them. It's like, well, okay, fun. But if we don't know what happens to those people at the end, and all those little loops stay open, then we realize they weren't even there for any larger purpose. And so, in that way, the characters don't even have arcs really either. There's a possible exception for the Secretary of Defense over here, or as I like to call him, Moriarty, right? Because in the end, he walks off a building when he finds out that the target of the missile is Chicago, where his estranged daughter lives. But even with that, we really don't see the aftermath of it. We don't see the impact, pun not intended, even with his daughter. So those are like the micro loop problems. But let me talk about the biggest problem, the biggest open loop, which is the ending itself, because it doesn't have one. Remember, the macro level narrative question that the whole film was building up toward is never answered, right? And because this macro level question is built up because we see it several times and then never get a resolution to it, it's even more impactful that it's not there, because we have the first kind of act, inclination is flattening, and then we reset and the clock starts over and we see the same events from a different perspective. Hit a bullet with a bullet. It all builds up. What's going to happen? Now, this is the second time we've gotten to the point where the missile is about to hit, and then we reset. And then we see it again a third time, this time with the president. And then we finally get to the end, and we're going to see what happens. And then we don't. So we've got these narrative questions in here. Does the missile even hit Chicago? Who attacked? Not only who, but why? What will be the president's response? And will the bomber pilots that we saw even be able to drop the nukes? Will they be even willing to after all this training? Because we built them up as seeing, oh, they're real people, and this guy's a kid, and are they going to do it? Well, never find out, because it's like having a 4-part miniseries with 3 episodes in a row that all end with the same cliffhanger, and you can't wait to find out what's going to happen in the 4th and final episode, only to find out there is no 4th episode. Now, as Bigelow and screenwriter Noah Oppenheim would probably point out, the whole point of the film is that it's one big open loop. They don't want to close the open loop because then they want to keep people thinking about what could have happened at the end. Catherine Bigelow says, the film's unresolved ending is an invitation. I want audiences to leave thinking, what do we do now? This is a global issue. We want to reduce the nuclear stockpile, which it has been reduced. It's really low compared to where it was in the 80s. But now there's talks about, re-signing agreements with Russia, and China is actually building up its arsenal, even though Russia and the US have lowered theirs, all that kind of stuff. But anyway, in the meantime, we really are living in a house of dynamite, so it was important to get that information out there so we could start a conversation. That's the explosion we're interested in. Conversation people have about the film afterward. Okay. You want a conversation. You want it to end in a bang with a conversation, right? Same thing in the Hollywood Reporter. There's so much talk about the ending. Catherine and I wanted the movie to invite the audience to leave in, not to give anyone an easy out or tied up with a bow. Now, I agree that might not be the best way to end it, but you could still have an ending and it not be endings like that, you know? We want to instigate reflection and conversation, and we give a lot of credit to Netflix for letting Catherine make the movie she envisioned. The ending is driving people to talk more about this subject, and it's exactly what we hoped for. It sounds like it's resonating with some people, just not me, apparently. Right? And then Bigelow says, this question, like the other movies she's made, the film itself poses a question and gives the audience an opportunity to answer. Wow. Now, I think something like that could have worked if this had been a stage play, right? it might have worked because that's a different medium, and that kind of lends itself to the sort of contemplative, abrupt ending. But with a film, instead of audiences thinking about what might have happened, they're thinking instead about how they felt at the end, because there's no real ending, right? They feel confused, they feel disappointed, or they even feel angry. And that's what they'll remember, at least some of them. And so if you really dug this movie's lack of ending, then, I get it. It feels edgy, it seems really risky, and it is risky. This is a bold move from an Oscar-winning director of the highest caliber. So I do respect that. It is a big risk. But I wonder if they did any test screenings to see what audiences' reactions would be. Because, at least for my wife and I, when the credits rolled, we just felt cheated, right? It did not make me want to lean in. It just made me annoyed because I'll never know what happened in the end. And so, in that way, it had the opposite of its intended effect, which is societal impact. And the reason why I mention impact is because the film's outcome, the outcome of the story, actually ties directly back to the impact that the film will have, whether it's on an individual viewer or society at large. And here's what I mean by this. When I'm teaching film analysis to my undergrads, I talk about the 5 ways that films need to be evaluated apart from their formal qualities or their, aesthetic elements. And one of those 5, the last one, is outcome. Outcome is looking at what happens at the end of the story and why. Does the ending make sense of everything that came before it? Is the ending open to interpretation or not? Is there evidence for a certain type of ending or not if it's ambiguous? And is the resolution congruent with the rest of the narrative? And so that's why the ending of your screenplay is so crucial, because the outcome then informs everything that happened previously in the story. And that's why, in my opinion, that some of the best movies are the ones that get better when you rewatch them. But with House of Dynamite, I don't think it'll have the same rewatchability or impact because of its lack of outcome. And so, just to drive this home, let's compare this ending of the 2025 film to another movie with a somewhat similar concept, War Games. So, in the 1983 War Games film, if you haven't seen it, definitely go and watch it. A high school hacker accidentally causes an early form of AI computer to think that the Soviet Union is attacking the United States, and then it prepares to launch a counterstrike. And since the computer can't tell the difference between what's a game or what's reality, they spend the rest of the film trying to prevent the computer from starting World War III. But it does have an ending. The hacker and a scientist are able to teach the computer about no-win scenarios through tic-tac-toe, and nuclear war is averted. Why am I bringing this film up? It was just some, popcorn flick from the 80s, right? It's basically forgotten now, except for people who are nostalgic for it. Film had a huge impact when it came out, and even caught the attention of President Ronald Reagan. He had the film screened for his staff at Camp David, and then he point blank after the film asked his national security advisors, "Is this kind of hack of our nuclear system, at the time it's called NORAD, is that even possible?" And they went and looked into it, having seen the film, and they said, "Mr. President, it's actually far worse." And that led to his administration issuing uh, the National Security Decision Directive 145. Execute Directive 145. Right? And so that was the first presidential policy which addressed what we now call cyber warfare. All right. And the film also led to Congress passing the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act of 1986. And it also kept people talking about the dangers of, you know, automated systems in nuclear war and not having any human oversight. And so, despite its happy ending, war games influenced government policy at the highest level. And so, I don't think it would have had such an impact if its ending had been left unfinished. Why? Because audiences like catharsis. Audiences want closure. It's hardwired in our brains from all of the stories that we hear and see every year. Even if you're in a different culture and there's a different type of, typical story arc, like in Japan, the Hisotenketsu, there is still a type of resolution at the end of that type of arc. And so when I think about War Games versus House of Dynamite, because I think this is a really good case study because of the similar desired impact and subject matter, when someone left the theater after seeing War Games, because it had a satisfying resolution, they were able to leave that theater on a high note, subconsciously thinking about the good feeling that they've had from the satisfying ending, and then consciously able to think about the concepts brought up by the film of automated warfare and mutually assured destruction, compared to, like I was saying with House of Dynamite, where I can't even get to that point because the lack of resolution was such a bad experience, because it left out this fundamental step in closing that open loop and bringing closure to the story so I can then think about the broader themes that were within the story. When it comes down to it, I'm not saying you can't have ambiguous endings. I'm just saying that the ambiguous ending still has to mean something, right? There still needs to be an ending present and give the audience some sense of closure or catharsis. And then because that open loop has been closed, you can think about the deeper meaning behind the film as an audience member. And so that's why I brought up the world of UX, or user experience, and behavioral psychology, because as a screenwriter, especially if you are a writer director like me, then you're not just telling a story, you are also designing an experience. Finally, before I let you go, there's one last aspect of the film that I want to analyze because I think you're going to get a lot out of it. And it is a little known screenwriting concept